Paulo Figueiredo is the grandson of a former president of Brazil and was Brazil's most popular journalist, until the Brazilian Supreme Court declared his reporting misinformation and canceled his passport, froze his bank accounts, and suspended his social media. He says that leftist ideology, anti-Americanism, and Iran and China's growing influence inside Brazil are a threat to the entire Western world. This is a warning that Americans need to start paying attention to what is happening in South America before it's too late. I think when most Americans think about Brazil, they think about soccer, amazing food, meat, and probably the carnival. But now we're starting to think about Brazil as political turmoil and some danger emerging even towards the United States. So I wanted to bring you in to talk to you about what is happening in this huge partnering nation of ours, and what should Americans know and contemplate as things are changing in that region. Tell us a little bit about your background. Your grandpa was obviously quite famous, and it's pretty amazing to hear that somebody who is the grandson of a former president of Brazil now doesn't feel safe living in Brazil, but chooses to live here in the United States of America.
Thanks for having me. Yes, I come from a family that's very traditional in Brazil, of patriot. My great-grandfather was the general that fought against Getúlio Vargas, which was the dictator of Brazil. He started a revolution against the fascist dictator, and he lost, and he was a political prisoner for years. That was in the 30s. Many years later, in the 80s, his son became the president. He was the last general that was the president of Brazil. He was the one that made the transition from the military government towards full civilian democracy. And a lot of it was because he was persecuted. His father was persecuted, so he was the son of a political, almost refugee. It's bad that Brazil, you used to think of about all these good things about Brazil, and now you think about what's going on. And I think what we're facing now are the same challenges that the United States and most of the Western world are facing, but just with institutions that are not as strong, and so we're facing it in a harder way.
I want to get to know a little bit about your family and you more. Do you remember your grandpa? And did you have a relationship with him?
Very close, yeah.
What did he stand for? Was he conservative? Was he on the left?
He was very conservative.
He was.
This was very conservative, with all the conservative values. And he died when I was 17. So he died when I got into journalism school, and he hated journalists for a good reason. Although the press wasn't as bad back in his time as it is right now. But the last thing was him being disappointed that I was becoming a journalist. But he was very influential in my life.
Tell me a little bit about the history of what has been happening recently in Brazil. Why is it my impression that there is complete political turmoil? Describe a little bit what happened with Bolsonaro and Lula and this very visible corruption.
Sure. It was interesting because after my grandfather left office, all the civilians that came after him were from some flavor of the left. They were all leftists. So you had, in the beginning, Sarney, and then you have Fernando Henrique Cardoso, who was the president in the mid-90s until early 2000s for 2 terms. It was George Soros guy in Brazil, the professor of Sorbonne, very, I would say, the sophisticated European left. And then you had Lula, which was always, since the 80s. My grandfather actually arrested Lula in the 80s. He was a union leader and very Marxist, very Stalinist in a way, old, raw communism, very nationalist, which is interesting. But Lula, in 2002, Lula hired a marketing expert that changed him completely. He started wearing nice suits, drinking sophisticated wines, and he signaled to the establishment that he would be more moderate. And that's how he got elected, and he was elected, and he was extremely popular because at the same time, he fulfilled everything that this establishment, more sophisticated left wanted. But also he was very populist in the sense that he started very successful programs, and Brazil was facing a good moment in the economy because of the way that the world was set up.
When was that?
And that was early 2000s. From 2003, that Lula took office in 2003, and then he left in 2012.
So would you say that his first term, he was pretty popular and generally successful?
Very popular. Well, remember, Brazil is a commodity producer, and that was the time that China was booming. So China desperately needed Brazilian commodities. And so because of that, Brazil had a lot of money. And instead of using that money to pay the debt or invest in infrastructure, they used to create a big government with a big social welfare program. And that was electorally very successful. So Lula made his successor, which was a lady called Dilma Rousseff. She's now the president of the BRICS Bank. And she did one term, and then the economy started paying the price for the policies that Lula started, because they started spending so much. And once the world economy was not doing so well, the Brazilian government ran out of money. Also, the corruption reached levels that was unimaginable. So the whole purpose of the Brazilian government at one point, all the Brazilian public companies, the Brazilian government, was to generate money for the Socialist Workers' Party in Brazil. And we're talking about billions and billions, to the point that the Operation Car Wash started investigating what was going on. So I'm talking about 2014 to 2015, Operation Car Wash started investigating corruption. And at the same time, Dilma was facing political problems because the economy was doing very badly. Brazil was in the worst economical crisis in its history, because once she couldn't buy out all the politicians to support her, she started losing support. So she ended up being impeached in 2015.
Can you explain what is Operation Car Wash and how is President Lula connected to it?
Sure. Operation Car Wash started as a small operation investigating some dollar deals in the south of Brazil. But then it became a huge thing because they used a very interesting method inspired in what happened with the Clean Hands operation in Italy. So they started getting people, arresting them, and making deals, like the prosecution making deals with them, so they would appoint other people that were involved, and then they would arrest these other people that would appoint the people that were involved in the top, and he went all the way to arresting Lula for corruption. He was actually convicted. In Brazil has a weird system with 4 tiers. Okay. It's not like the US. You have the first degree court, and then you have the appeals court, and Brazil has 4 degrees. So Lula was convicted all the way to the 3rd degree by a panel of judges twice for corruption.
Who are these people who came after Lula and convicted him? Who are these people, and why did they come after him?
It's interesting because these people are mostly from the establishment.
This is why I don't understand.
Yes, they're from the establishment, but they're from remember I told you about like Fernando Henrique Cardoso, of the other flavor of the left, more globalist, more educated, and they were tired with the corruption and inefficiency of the Lula government. And so they decided, well, it's time for us to go back to what we had with Fernando Henrique. So not exactly that, but a flavor of that. Mm-hmm. I can't say they only had bad motivations. I think maybe they had a sense of this country is going in the wrong direction. Mm-hmm. The problem is that in this process, they disrespected the due process of law completely. At one point, they were doing illegal wiretaps. They were torturing mentally, and in some cases, possibly physically, the prosecutors, people. And they used methods that were just bad. Lula, for example, I think, it's my opinion, a lot of people disagree with me, but I don't think he was properly convicted. I think the Supreme Court found an excuse to take him out of prison so he could run for office. To the point that from a legal perspective, I understand that the argument that they made was correct, that Sergio Moro was not the correct judge to try Lula.
What was he convicted for?
He was convicted for corruption. He got money from construction companies in Brazil.
While he was president?
While he was president, yes.
And so they basically took him out. He was sent to jail. But then they said that the process that they sent him to jail through was actually flawed. And they pulled him out of jail, cleaned his record, and had him run for president again. Is that right?
That is correct. What happened was that, so the left, the establishment got rid of Lula. They got rid of Lula because they said, we want to go back to the way things were with the other flavor of the left. So the problem was the world was not the same. With social media and this national populist movement, people were speaking, the media lost the monopoly of the facts. The spiral of silence was broken. I like the way that Andrew Clavin says Donald Trump was the Godzilla of the crazy experiments that the left made, and the monster, the Godzilla came up. Bolsonaro was the Godzilla from Brazil. No one ever expected that he was going to win. And he won. And we had these guys that got rid of Lula, they were like, oh, this is not what we wanted. So at one point, the same people, I'm talking about the mainstream media, the judicial system, the prosecutors, the established, the financial market, the same people that got rid of Lula tried to find someone that could defeat Bolsonaro because, whoa, this is way worse. This is way worse than what we had. So who can defeat Bolsonaro? So they tried the third way. That's how they called it. So they tried several third way candidates. That was not Bolsonaro and not Lula. But the problem is none of them have votes. So they had to find a way to reestablish Lula as a candidate. And Lula brought a vice president that's from that same faction, globalist faction from the left, was the former governor of São Paulo, who was he ran against him in 2014, I believe, or 2010. But now he's the vice president. So the guy that ran against Lula, representing the more right, is now Lula's vice president. That's how big the establishment is in Brazil. So they rehabilitated Lula, and the same media that used to call him a crook started saying that he had clean records. The same Supreme Court justices that badmouthed him said he had a perfect record, and now they're now his friends. So that's what happened. And then he got back in power with an election that was that favored him, the whole process in so many ways I couldn't describe.
What was told to Brazilian citizens who knew that Lula was first sent to jail? How were they convinced that? Did they say, oh, this was a huge mistake, or there was corruption? Did they throw someone under the bus? Like, how do you take somebody from being a villain to being the next president? Is it just constant media brainwashing? Like, how did they do that?
The media matters way more in Brazil than it does here. It's way more influential in Brazil than it is here, the mainstream media. Here in the US, I think the process of them losing the credibility completely is almost done. No one trusts the media, and the polls show that, right? So the media has a lot of importance in Brazil, and they openly campaigned for Lula. That was one side. The other side is that the Supreme Court bluntly censored anyone that said anything bad about Lula.
That sounds actually familiar.
Yeah, I was telling you, I think Brazil and the US, they have the same virus, and the virus comes from the United States. I joke that the Americans' universities are the one lab. They
of
come
bad
up
ideas.
with the bad ideas. They come up with the virus. But in Brazil, for example, instead of having the FBI telling people from Twitter that they shouldn't publish a story, or Mark Zuckerberg because it's Russian disinformation, in Brazil was not like that. In Brazil, I was on TV on the #1 political show on prime time, and I used to have orders saying the Supreme Court decided, the Superior Electoral Court decided that you can't talk about this For example, this is a real thing. I couldn't say on air that Lula was unconvicted of corruption because he was never found not guilty. He was convicted and he was unconvicted. So we used to play with that language, but then the Superior Electoral Court decided, although that was true, we couldn't say it because it was going to mislead the public.
You had
Peraí, desculpe interromper esse vídeo, mas é que eu continuo censurado pelo STF. Além deles cancelarem o meu passaporte, congelarem todas as minhas contas bancárias e bloquearem as minhas redes, agora eles também querem proibir os meus vídeos no Brasil. Você pode continuar me acompanhando seguindo o meu segundo canal, que é o canal de cortes. E se quiser ter acesso a todas as minhas postagens para sempre, deve se inscrever no meu Locals, que funciona de uma forma parecida com o Facebook ou o Twitter. Todos os links estão aqui na descrição. Entra lá, senão você vai ficar desinformado e aí eles vão vencer. Façam o tal do triplo C. Curta, comenta, porque a integração do chat ajuda muito, e compartilhe. Você pode fazer essas 3 coisas que ajudam o algoritmo a aparecer. Mas eu não tô brincando não, pessoal. Dá uma paradinha agora de 1 segundo e clica no joinha, porque às vezes a pessoa já está acostumada a ouvir isso. Não, é importante que você faça isso, porque se você não fizer, inclusive atrapalha o vídeo. Parece que o vídeo é menos relevante.
Então, também faço aqui o meu convite da minha parte para você assinar a plataforma do Fio Diário e começar a acompanhar uma plataforma realmente livre e que vai dar oportunidade das pessoas falarem o que pensam e dizerem a verdade. Se você não incentivar um veículo de mídia independente como esse, quem vai fazer por você?